Hello, and welcome to tutorial number 6 in the Sociology of Material Culture. Today, we're going to be talking about something that's going to be especially important for completing assignment 2, because in previous assignments, the main purpose was to get you to think theoretically and to kind of make a theoretical argument, right, based on the difference between two scholarly approaches to studying your object. So, of course, empirical examples or concrete examples were helpful in that paper, but that wasn't kind of the main thing that we were trying to practice in that assignment. In assignment 2, one of the challenges is going to be kind of thinking on two tracks, right? Thinking both theoretically as you were doing in that previous assignment. The difference, but being instead of grappling with two big perspectives, you really only need to kind of grapple with one. But we'll get into that a bit more in a second. But right, as I was saying, like assignment number 2, we're trying to get you to think on both tracks. So we want you to think theoretically and empirically and show how these link up. So today we're going to go through the basic components of a research proposal. And then we're going to be especially getting into like what is operationalization mean, and how can you go about crafting a sociological data collection plan. So yeah, and the exercise at the end, as normal, we'll be doing one of those, and that's going to build off of kind of our conversation, or I mean the discussion that I'm presenting here today. And getting you to provide you kind of jumping off point. So it's, if you want, you can try to generate your own kind of research question. Although if you want to just kind of practice, there's one there for you that you can use. And then, it'll get you to kind of generate different questions that you would be able to ask, out in the social world to collect data. So, yeah, I think that's all I want. Oh, actually, one more thing before I get into the basic components of the research proposal. I just wanted to kind of mention that this kind of assignment, the research proposal paper that comes at the end of the class, it's a pretty standard kind of upper year sociology assignment. So it's good to be getting practice in this now. And hopefully the tips that we're going to be going through today will serve you well in your if you're taking a fourth year sociology class next year, or even if you're interested in going on to doing graduate work, or even like doing research in business or industry contexts. The discussion should hopefully provide you a good foundation going forward in those sorts of endeavors. So yeah, let's get into it. All right, so I tried my best to kind of boil down a research proposal into its kind of most essential components. And we'll flesh them out a bit more here, but yeah, what I came up with is a question, a theory, previous work, and a data collection plan. So we're going to go through each of these points. I just want to say, yeah, the data collection plan, this involves not only kind of going out in the world and talking to people, or, downloading a database of survey responses or something like that. It also involves logical work of linking theory to the world in a convincing way, right? So that's just important to note. But let's go through it. So yeah, you need to have a question that's at the center of your research proposal. So this is very much like a thesis statement for papers that are trying to advance an argument. So yeah, like a thesis statement, this is going to be one of the single most difficult sentences to write in your research proposal paper. So I just want to kind of note that off the bat, so that it's worth noting that, because it might kind of evolve throughout the writing process. It might be something that you need to tinker with so that you can achieve like ultimate clarity, right? That's one of the major challenges of good writing, is making sure that what you're saying, or in this case what you're asking, is really clear to the reader. So yeah, that's just something that's worth noting. Generally, the question should kind of grapple with the relationship between two things. It doesn't necessarily need to be like a causal argument, or like a causal relationship or a question about causality, like, what, like, I didn't have an example off the top of my head here, but like a classic sociological kind of relationship, right, is like, the more education that somebody has, the more income they get when they're on the job market. So this could be like a basic kind of causal relationship, right? Like, what's the relationship between educational achievement and income? Or like the top income that somebody achieves in their lifetime. So, right, like, this is a question. This is a really broad question and not one that we're going to be dealing with in this class. I just kind of wanted to show an example of a question has to have some sort of like two components in terms of like, what's the relationship between this? That's a very conventional sociological one, which is also causal. But again, it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. We're going to be talking about an example. I'll present one later, which isn't necessarily causal like that, but is more kind of open-ended, which even the causal kind of question that I asked, that one's open-ended, right? Like, there's various kind of answers to that question. Like, it could be that at a certain cap, once you get like a master's degree or something, that there's diminishing returns on like how much income that you get, which I think is generally true. But anyway, so this question needs to be open-ended. It needs to have kind of at least two components, like what's the relationship between these two things, and the answer can't be like immediately obvious, or there can't be like an immediately obvious strong explanation. So yeah, let's talk about theory a little bit and how these are kind of related, because you need to be, your question needs to be grounded in a sociological theory, and the theory needs to kind of inform your question. So yeah, it's kind of hard all of these things are wrapped together, but they're distinct, right? So you're using your theory to generate a question. So this could be like a what if I were to take this theory and apply it to a context that I'm familiar with. Does it check out? Does something seem wrong with it? Right? Like, that's the kind of thinking that you're going to be needing to do, that will guide the kind of like, how is your theory guiding your question? And especially in the case of this assignment, you're going to need to ask yourself, how is my selected theory relevant for methodological fetishism, right? So I think that there's going to be really different ways of constructing your question and coming up with a data collection plan if you're looking at like the life history of a material object. So how have vinyl turntables, like the meaning of vinyl turntables, changed over the last century or something like that, right? Like, that question is going to be really different versus like, what makes vinyl turntable so valuable to people in the this current context when digital means of like streaming music and listening to music are so accessible and etc., things like that. Like, that's like a bit of a puzzle that's related to the theory, and there's various explanations that we can think of. So now that we're moving more empirically, something that's really important is to cover what previous work has done, different ways of either contributing to the theory or challenging the theory, twisting the theory in certain ways based on empirical analysis. So it's going to be especially relevant, I think we talked about this like really early on in a tutorial, but different kind of strategies of note-taking. So it's really important to note what the empirical data set authors are using to make their argument. Sometimes there's none. Sometimes it's a theoretical argument where they're more like, authors have had these kind of theories. Like these are really complicated papers. I'm sure we have a few of them in this class, but for papers that have an empirical data set, or they're like, oh, I'm going to cover these, historical cases of things that happened, or, we interviewed so many people, or we, analyzed this survey data, or whatever. When that sort of previous work is relevant to the theory that you're working with and can maybe help to shed light on your question or something like that, right? That needs to be covered in the paper. So, and an important way of thinking about this previous work is as kind of a jumping off point for your own empirical study, right? So it's like this author studied this group of people, like they operationalized this abstract concept that's relevant to sociologists in this way, and I'm asking like, what if we operationalized it this other way? So just to kind of explain that a little bit, like say there's a study that you are covering, there's a study that like operationalizes artists by studying, I don't know, glass blowers or people who paint, right? And you say like, oh, but how does this apply to songwriters or people who work in like a different physical medium like sculpture? Are there things that we need to change in the theory or the concept to understand that better? So that's the kind of way that you can use previous work as a kind of jumping off point in terms of like, they operationalized these concepts this way. What if you operationalize them this way? Is there going to be something that's unexplained, or is there conceivably something where it's like, oh, well, there's a whole different process here, so it's not accounted for, or something like that? These are the sorts of like the kind of like thinking that you should be doing when you're working through your notes and thinking about like, the research topics that interest you, or just kind of the logical outcomes of kind of grappling with the material object that you've selected to kind of center your research proposal around. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the data collection plan and operationalization. So basically the rest of the tutorial is going to be talking about that, and then we'll get into the skills exercise for this week. So I'm just going to move on to the next slides here now to talk about data collection plan and operationalization. All right, so operationalization is one of those like really intimidating $20 social scientific terms like ontology or epistemology or whatever, but it's basically about how you measure something abstract. And so this could be something that's like very familiar to us, like age or gender, right? These seem really obvious, like how would you measure age? Well, by years, but there's other ways of doing it, and it will depend on your question and your theory, right? Like you can measure age by which decade your research participants were born in, or something else like that, right? Gender, again, that's something that's familiar, but like how many gender categories are you going to include? How are you going to term your gender categories? Are you going to include an other or prefer not to disclose, right? And like why is that valuable to your research project and answering your research question? And what does that mean like to your whole research project? So it can be like familiar, like these are abstract concepts, age and gender. They can be more familiar things, or they can be more, sociologically complex things like symbolic capital or cultural capital or something like that, right? So even though these are this can be pretty intimidating to be like, I'm operationalizing symbolic capital. It's like, wow, that's I have no idea what you're talking about. Well, somebody outside of sociology won't know what you're talking about necessarily, but in really basic terms, operationalizing your components, the components of your research question, is really asking you, how do you like grab on to the abstract components that you're asking about? How do you grab onto them in real life? So yeah, let's get into an example here that we're going to use to kind of think through this operationalization thing, and forward from there. Because after you operationalize something, you have to actually consider like how you're going to collect the data. So yeah, but let's talk more about operationalization here. So let's just imagine we're working with a research question like, how do artists negotiate the constraining effects of art world conventions? So this is connected to Becker's theory of art worlds. And, the question here is like, there are conventions in art worlds, and artists need to negotiate that. How do they do it? So like I was mentioning earlier, this isn't necessarily a causal question as to like what causes artists to, I don't know, revolt against constraining art world conventions, or what explains like successful change in art conventions or something like that, right? But all those things, those could be considered more like causal questions. Like it has to do with like very enthusiastic artists and I don't know, things like that. There's good books on this, but this is beside the point. This question here that we're going to be talking about, it's not necessarily a causal argument, right? It's more, what's the relationship between constraining art world conventions and artists? How do they deal with them? So how would you operate? Like, okay, so yeah, now we need to break up this research question into its distinct abstract components, and then think about how we're going to study that in the real world. So, variable A here is artists, variable B is constraining conventions. So yeah, I'm just going to use an example of something that I'm familiar with. But for the assignment, right, you're going to be talking about a cultural object. It could be the pop song format, I guess. But anyway, in this case, I'm going to say, let's operationalize artists as songwriters. Songwriters are creative people who are dealing with who work within, with arguably an art world, in Becker's perspective, and deal with constraining conventions. So, I'm going to operationalize artists as songwriters, and I'm going to operationalize constraining conventions as what's known as this 3-minute song format. So, again, this is something that's familiar to me. I don't know if this is like interesting to anybody else, but one of the things about pop music is that there are conventions, and one of the conventions is, just the length of the song. So it's really rare for a song that's on the radio to be longer than, 3 minutes and 30 seconds. It does exist, but this is a general convention that shapes the creative work of songwriters. Okay, so now we've kind of concretized the abstract parts of our theory, and kind of explained, like, that's an important part too, like explaining how it fits and why it makes sense, right? Like what I was saying was, like, songwriters, they have a creative process, they make new things all the time, you can consider them artistic, and they deal with constraining conventions. So just kind of explaining that. So now that we've that's going to be necessary in the proposal. Once you've done that, now you need to make a data collection plan. So it's like, okay, now we have songwriters, now we have a focus that we want to talk about, this 3-minute song format. Where do we go from here? So now you need to craft a sociological data collection plan. Okay, so let's start big and then we'll get small. So starting with these huge philosophical questions. What is empirical data? How can you, amass empirical data? How can you actually collect it or get it? What is the value of, like, one hypothetical data set over another? Because again, remember, that's what you're really doing in this assignment, is proposing a hypothetical data set. You're not going out and collecting it. You're not, you're not collecting it. You're not analyzing it. You're not doing anything like that. It's more like, based on my reading of, this theory and my understanding of this, I have a inkling that I could contribute to this kind of research question through this kind of empirical data set. Again, these are all very kind of big picture abstract things that we're going to provide some concrete examples really shortly. But these are the sorts of philosophical questions you should ask yourself as you're kind of considering moving forward in crafting a plan of data collection that you'll present in the assignment. So to kind of make these a bit more focused, think like questions that you're going to be able to have answered before starting writing, or for other people like me, I usually kind of answer it through the writing process. It's just kind of like a trial and error kind of thing for me. I don't know if other people can relate to that, but either way, if you prefer to kind of have it shaped in your head before starting to write, or writing more consistently and doing like a trial and error and editing thing, whatever your preferred approach is, things that need to be immediately clear to you, either at the start or at the end of that process, is like, what is your empirical data? How did you collect or amass that data set? And what's the value of that proposed data set? Kind of a bit more complex analysis, it's not necessary like to do well on this assignment, but would be to like compare a different data set. But again, it's not necessary. It's more about emphasizing like, why is this data that you're proposing so valuable? How does it build off of or use previous research as a jumping off point? And what's so valuable about it? You don't need to kind of like dunk on other people or be like, yeah, I'm going to do interviews and people who do surveys are wrong and they miss all of these things. You don't need to do that just for the sake of doing it. If there's like a valuable point or something interesting to say there, then go for it. But it's more about that sort of comparison or a different approach. It just needs to emphasize like, what's the value of the data set that you're proposing? So that's kind of like general thinking. Now we'll get into a bit more some concrete examples. Sorry. A few more general things before we get into the concrete examples. I just want to talk about, kind of the general components of what you should be thinking about when you're like crafting this data collection plan. These are like, what's the empirical data? What's the collection plan? And this is something that doesn't necessarily need to be considered in the paper, but is going to be really helpful just to kind of make sure that the data collection plan, or just kind of the way that you're fitting theory and methods together, is as strong as it possibly can be. Is going to be to consider alternatives. So this is more of just kind of like a note-taking, sketching out ideas kind of phase in the paper, which is going to be like kind of the, one concrete way of asking this is like, would it be better to do interviews, or would it be better to do surveys for this type of question? Or would it be, do I need to go observe people, or could I just talk to them? Are there like available data that I could go download, right? Like, do I just, if I just need to, for some reason, if you're, a good example could be like, if you wanted to study, online discourse or something, right? Like, how would you propose to like go and download all of this discussion and then analyze it? So these are just some general empirical data. It's not, exhaustive. I'd suggest, if you want to kind of get a broad survey of different kind of sociological data collection plans, like just check out like a methods textbook or something at the library or on the online library website, just to be like, oh, what are the kind of possibilities that are available to me? And just a word of warning too, I guess, of that, like, the most complex methods aren't necessarily the most impressive. So it's a research proposal that's like, I'm going to do, block modeling and the statistical analysis and blah, blah, blah. It's really easy to kind of go wrong in that. It's more just like thinking more like, would it be better to, go out and talk to people in this certain way, or would it be better to kind of take the scope up more broadly to like a survey context, so that you can like sample a nation rather than, get a really in-depth understanding of a small group of people. Yeah, so again, yeah, these are kind of general data or kind of collection plans that you can approach. We'll get into some concrete examples in a second. One last thing I just want to mention, just kind of about the assignment, and about the kind of going forward and thinking about the examples, in terms of like, this data collection plan and like what it means in concrete terms. We want the collection plan to be realistic from the perspective, like, again, you're not actually ever going to do this, and you can imagine that like the data collection plan is just going to go smoothly. So you can assume that like you're the one who's doing the data collection, and that just like imagine you have like a good research budget, right? Like, so you can go places and talk to people and develop, if you need to develop like a relationship with some sort of organization that you're going to observe, or right, like if you want to study an object in a retail space, like think about what it means to get access to that retail space, and whether you want to study more than one and what that would mean and whatever. But yeah, just imagine you have like a good research budget, so you could do that. Also, approaching the research proposal that way, linking back to what we were talking about last week, so it'll help you to write like really clear active sentences, and you can use I, especially in this case when you're talking about your data collection plan. Like, I will spend 2 years hanging out with painters to observe how they negotiate contracts with somebody. I don't know, right? Like, that's like a thing. Anyway, so yeah, these are the kind of just those. Now we're at the end of all the general things I wanted to say. Now we'll get into more kind of concrete examples based on our previous research question, right? Like the how do artists negotiate art world conventions. So one way of operationalizing, the way that we're operationalizing it, right, is songwriters and time constraints in songs, popular music. So we're going to talk about like 3 different data collection plans that could work. And I'm just going to kind of, think through this here. So hopefully that's helpful to just kind of think about like, what are the different things that you should be considering? Okay, so example A. We're going to be interviewing songwriters about these conventional time constraints. So, something that you're going to need to specify is like what category of songwriters. Like, I'm not expecting people to be interviewing, some sort of esoteric prog rock songwriters or post rock songwriters or something like that, where the songs are like generally 12 to 15 minutes. Like, obviously they won't have, like, they'll have something to say about the conventional time constraints, but they're not the ones dealing with it. So that's not like the most appropriate group of people. So it's like, okay, yeah, I'm going to interview pop songwriters in LA and New York. That makes sense. And then, in practical terms, like, how many do you plan to interview? Again, just imagine it's just you doing this, and so you can, and also, thinking about like pop music songwriters might not be the most easy people to access. So you can be like, I want to, aim for this many, 50 songwriters, but I know that they're a difficult population to access. So, maybe it might be more like 20 or something like that. And just kind of talking about strategies of like, and being able to acknowledge that, right? Like, this is a difficult population to access because, they're generally really busy, and they might not be interested in taking an interview. Anyway, so these are kind of like the practical considerations you should consider when you're thinking about like an interview. Okay, another option, right? Like, you don't need to conduct the interviews yourself. So again, these people are really busy. They're doing interviews with other people all the time, in ways that like further their career rather than contribute to your research project and not much else. So another approach could be just to collect published interviews and, you know, identify examples where songwriters discuss this convention. So that's totally an option. The sorts of questions that you would want to ask yourself are like, what publications do I want to use? What's the time frame of the kind of big data set I'm going to initially collect and then try to comb through for examples, and why do I expect to like find something like that, right? Like you would want to use like you wouldn't necessarily want to use like a more consumer publication that's more like about like why is your band named that, like that's like a less interesting that's less likely to yield that sort of thing. Like you might want to take like a songwriting magazine right, where they're actually more likely to discuss these sorts of conventions. Or there might be relevant articles about it, right? Like it doesn't necessarily need to be interviews. It could even be like, yeah, like you could select like songwriting magazines or musician magazines or something like that, and try to pull out examples of discussions of this and be like, so what are the general patterns in this sort of discussion? What can we learn about how songwriters talk about navigating this particular convention in this published record of, you know, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, whatever. And then another note too, like when thinking about these publications, right, like in thinking about like, oh, well, what's going to be the most appropriate one? Like if we wanted songwriters talking insider baseball, to use an expression, just sort of like, yeah, insider knowledge. Like if you want songwriters talking about like, yeah, the insider knowledge, where would we go to get that? Or you can think about like, what would be a really interesting contrast to use, right? Like if you're going to be collecting interviews with songwriters, maybe it could be like, okay, I want to collect publications that deal with hip hop music, you know, rock music and country music, so that I can draw some sort of comparison. And I'm interested in like, you know, and you know, there's some sort of theoretical there's like a theoretical context to the question that you're asking of these like, yeah, these three different genres, right? Okay, so yeah, third example, imagine you wanted to, you know, survey songwriters. This way, you know, if you're more interested, this is, you know, just a difference in scope, right? Interviews are more in-depth. They take about an hour at least. They're a bit harder to set up and things like that. Surveys, the questions take less long to answer generally, less demanding, kind of clicking boxes like agree, disagree, you know, how much do you disagree, whatever. And so basically I'm just saying that because you can get more participants. It's more realistic to, and it's more necessary to get at least over 100 participants in like a survey research project. So, you know, you can think about which countries would you survey, right? Like you can think about, oh, like how do Canadian, British, and American songwriters negotiate these conventions? So you would think about like, okay, I can survey these different countries and songwriters in them. And yeah, then like the questions you need to ask yourself is like, how could you plausibly contact all of these songwriters? You know, again, obvious-ish kind of answers would be like songwriters associations, or putting an ad out in these magazines that we were talking about, or, you know, putting an ad on, you know, a subreddit or something like that, right? Like just kind of thinking about like, how could you plausibly contact a good number of songwriters? And then how could you incentivize in terms of song surveys? There's usually, you know, a gift card or something like that. And again, imagine you have like a good research budget and it's like, okay, I can offer everyone like $50 at, you know, this music store or something like that. Just showing that you've thought this whole thing through, where it's like, yeah, I want to study people. How do I motivate people or incentivize them to like actually participate in this? That's generally more important when it comes to surveys than it is to interviews, because yeah, you want to incentivize it some way, but you know, generally in-depth interviews are like, people are really interested to talk about those things, so it's less that you need to yeah, like have like a $50 gift card or something. But again, you might be like, oh, I'll like bring them out for coffee and I'll pay for coffee, and that's part of your research budget, right? Great. So yeah, I hope that those three examples help you to kind of clarify, like, yeah, there's alternative options here. It just kind of depends on like the scope of your question, what you're interested in, yeah, and kind of the logical kind of implications of your research question. Okay, great. So we're just going to take a minute now to kind of sum up, and then we'll move on to the exercise. All right, so summing up, thinking empirically means specifying the real people of abstract sociological concepts. And thinking about that, it's like, okay, if you want to understand something, what would you ask these real people? Or what would you observe them doing? How many of them would you need to talk to or observe, right? To feel like you're going to be confident in your answer. Yeah, how could you plausibly talk to and observe all these people? And yeah, just one final note as just like a caveat on available data research. You could specify like real archives, or just like, again, like if you're going to be using like publications, like specifying real publications, right? Like there's a huge variety of objects that I know that you're going to be analyzing, and so yeah, if you want to go that route, it's think through like, oh, what are these relevant publications over the years? Or if it's a more mainstream thing like iPods, you could be like, how did the New York Times and, I don't know, a comparable Canadian publication, Globe and Mail, report on the emergence and kind of like, yeah, the emergence of the iPod or something, right? And how it's transformed over time into smartphones and things like that. I don't know. That's just kind of a vague example, but thinking through real people or real publications, real ways of studying these really abstract concepts, which can sometimes be extremely complex. Yeah, and thinking back to those 4 key components of the research proposal, being able to know how all of those fit together, being able to answer all of those questions, like what's the data, what's so valuable about it. These will go a long way in kind of clarifying what you're trying to say before you start writing, or at least acknowledging that, like, oh, I'll get a better sense of this by the time I write like a horrible draft, and then I can edit it to be good, depending on your style. So yeah, we'll leave it at that. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the skills exercise for this week, and that'll be it. All right, so the academic skills assignment for this week is going to get you to operationalize something and then develop 2 open-ended interview questions that would help you to answer your research question, and 1 or 2 survey questions as well, and then kind of adjudicating between like, what do you think would be better and why. So if you feel bold and want to practice developing your own your own kind of operationalizations of these concepts, feel free to do that. But if you want to kind of practice more of the thinking empirically side of this, you can just use the songwriters and the 3-minute song format example from the tutorial. So yeah, kind of backing up to the beginning here. Imagine your research question is, how do artists negotiate with the constraining effects of art world conventions? And part 1 is identify a population and a convention that you can use to operationalize this question. Again, if you're feeling bold, feel free to pick a different population. Could be, I don't know, painters and colors. Probably want to pick a subgenre if you're going to do that. But anyway, you can pick your own if you want, but you're welcome to just use songwriters in the 3-minute song format. And kind of the challenge from that point is to think of 2 open-ended interview questions that would help you to answer your research question. So again, these are like how questions, or like, tell me about this. It doesn't, like, that's the sort of question, just kind of prompting discussion. Come up with 2 of those. Maybe even thinking like, is there 2 sides? Like, what's something that's easy? What's something that's hard, right? that's a good kind of, or yeah, tell me about something that's easy, tell me about something that's hard. You know, these are, even though these aren't like necessarily questions, it's like prompts to get people talking. And then survey questions. So you can think of like, these are like binaries, like, or you can think of a scale, something like that. It's worth thinking about. And then finally, come up with a reason why you think one is better than the other in answering your research question. Great. So yeah, as normal, feel free to post any questions or comments in the discussion on Quarkus. But if not, I'll look forward to reading your submissions. And yeah, as a final note, there'll be an announcement too, but I'll be doing office hours next week to talk about assignment 2, if you'd like to drop in and chat about that. If you're unable to make those office hours, feel free to send an email with your questions. We might be able to land on a time that works for both of us. Generally, if it's like during the day, during the week, we should be able to manage if you got a couple options. But other than that, I'll look forward to meeting you in the drop-in rooms. So with that, I'll end the video, and I'll wish you a good week. All right, bye.